So just a quick introduction of myself. I'm Jennifer Jordan. I will be the person moderating the book club conversation with Shlomo and Nick. I'm a professor here of leadership and organizational behavior, and I'm also a big fan of not only Shlomo and Nick's work in general, but this book specifically. Just to introduce, for those of you who don't know Shlomo and Nick, Dr. Shlomo Ben-Hur is an organizational psychologist and a professor of leadership and organizational behavior at IMD. Before joining IMD, Shlomo spent more than 20 years in the corporate world, holding senior executive positions, including at BP in London, Daimler Chrysler in Berlin, and Sloan Kettering in New York. And he earned his doctoral degree in psychology from Humboldt University in Berlin. And Nick is a London-based consultant and coach with over 30 years experience specializing in assessing leaders, changing people's behavior, and evolving organizational cultures. His varied background includes commercial roles, senior corporate HR positions, and consulting roles, as well as over a decade working with prisoners as a forensic psychotherapist. He has thus worked with CEOs, managers, life sentence prisoners, and government officials, as well as children. And I guess, Nick, if we had more time, I would be so curious what these populations have in common, because I'm sure you've seen some commonalities, and also which are the hardest ones to work with.
That's so actually the full list is CEOs, royalty, politicians, life sentence prisoners, and children is and it's I'm more than happy to have that chat about which group is most difficult to work with. But I think we ought to run a poll first to see which group people think would be the most difficult to work with. I think there's interesting data in that too.
Children, for sure.
Yeah, we thought we had diversity at IMD, but certainly, Nick, with your background, I mean, you have covered the whole range.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great introduction to why we're here, right? This book to me is this beautiful intersection between life as leaders and our childhood, right? Coming together. So a brief introduction of why we're here today, right? We're going to be talking with Nick and Shlomo about this incredible book that they just published, giving you some insight into the author's views on this book. And maybe before we begin, at least in my time back in the US, when you didn't read a book and you had an exam, you would have the cliff notes that you would read, which was like the short introduction to everything you need to know about the book for your exam. I think today's generation would say the ChatGPT version of the book. But just for our listeners who haven't had the privilege of reading it yet, Nick and Shlomo, would you mind giving them kind of a cliff notes version of this book?
Nick, do you want to start?
Okay, sure. So we wrote this book because we kept having leaders come to us and we kept hearing that people were coming on leadership development courses, and then they were going back and they were going back into their workplaces full of great intentions, but then life would get in the way and things would happen, they'd get busy, and they would end up behaving in a way that they'd always ended up behaving, or they were getting frustrated that they couldn't change some things. And so that was our starting point. And we went from there to have a look at, we know there's all the research out there showing about how much under pressure leaders are. And we became interested in what's happening then. What is happening to our leaders in those moments? And the reality is that most of us in those situations are more instinctive. We like to think of ourselves as thoughtful, deliberate people. But when we're under pressure, when we're under stress, when we're right in the middle of a conversation, we actually tend to go with our feelings, go with our instincts. And we are less deliberate, less at poise than we often like to think that we are. And so the question then became, so what is coming out when that happens? And the reality is that most of us act on almost our default ways of behaving, instinctive ways of behaving that have been learned over many years. And when we dug into it and we had a look at, well, just where are those coming from? The answer is childhood, and hence the title, How Childhood Made You the Leader that you are. And so we read about 1,200 studies, and we tried to identify what are the most influential ways that childhood affect us as leaders. And we didn't want to write a book where we just said, guess what, childhood's important, full stop. Because it's like, well, yeah, right. I mean, I think most of us come to this knowing that childhood affects who we become. So what we've tried to do is go away and join up and make some specific links between specific childhood experiences, the effects they have on us, and then how that affects us as leaders in terms of what we are trying to do. And we've tried to draw out what are the aspects of our leadership style that are most affected, most influenced. And it's really three things that stand out. The first is what we focus on, what we pay attention to. The second is what we feel, how we emotionally react to events, and our ability to regulate these emotional reactions. And the third is aspects of our social behavior, such as our attitudes towards authority and how we respond to conflict. And in these areas in particular, there is some very clear evidence that joins up specific childhood experiences to the ways that we tend to behave today, and then how that affects us in critical moments when we're at work. And that's what the book is all about. It's about how does our childhood affect us in these three areas? And then, really importantly, a minor point, what can we do about it?
And I think what we can add to that is the childhood that we're talking about is really childhood. I mean, very early years, I mean, in the person's life, starting even in the womb before they are born. And we have a fair amount of research that is actually showing that even there's some sort of like formulation of sort of like the early connections that are being made. And up to sort of like the 5th to 7th years after the birth. I mean, so in spite of the fact that many people think that it's the adulthood, the young adulthoods, I mean, sort of like these ages between 10 and 17 or so, that are the ages where we form our personality, it's actually based on all of the evidence and based on the more than 1,000 articles that we have covered. I mean, in this research, we see that it's the first 5 years of a person's life that actually matter a great deal.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. I think it was a perfect introduction and summary of this book. And I should say, I love the book. I love rewriting your leadership code. And as a result, I have a lot of questions to ask you, and we invite questions from our audience. So we've reserved some time at the end for you to bring in your questions. So while Shlomo and Nick and I are talking, please put your questions in the chat, and I will select a few for the last 10 or 15 minutes that we can take from the audience. So is there a reason, Shlomo and Nick, that you decided to write this book now? Because I know this is your 4th book, or I believe this is your 4th book. Was there something that happened in your professional lives or in the world that encouraged you to write this book at this point in your careers or at this time in the world?
It's an interesting question, Jennifer. I mean, I think for me personally, and I'll let Nick answer this from his perspective, although I think there are some similarities there. For me, it's a coming home book. I mean, I started sort of like decades ago with my studies of psychology and study developmental psychology. I mean, and sort of like how neuropsychology is impacting our behaviors and all of that. And then I was gravitated towards industrial organizational psychology, which is really where I did my advanced studies in, and having worked, I mean, in organizations for many years, focusing on organizational culture and performance of organizations, all of those topics. And it's after all of these years that coming back to sort of like developmental psychology and sort of like childhood feels like sort of like closing a circle in many ways. But closing the circle happened not because I was so reminiscing on my early days, but it's because through my work with executives, with boards of managements, with people that are participating in the IMD programs, when we go into the depth of sort of like their makeup as a leader, and for some of the challenges that they face, we go back to childhood. And it's not us pushing that, it's them revealing it, or it emerges through the discussions. And that's where I felt that we actually needed to go back and to provide some terminology, some common foundation for that discussion to be more educated and to be able to provide them with some tools. Maybe I'll turn it to Nick. I mean, yeah, maybe you could say more about why you ended up with this.
So everything he said, plus I think for me, there's been a growing frustration that we tend to talk a lot and focus a lot on leaders' capabilities. But I think if you just even if you look at the political leaders that we've seen across the world over the last 4, 5, 10 years, I think what is equally important, if not more so, is the character that leaders bring. And I felt that was something that has been more neglect or less attention has been paid to, often slightly neglected. And yet, when we get into leadership roles, the higher up we go, the more exposed that character is and the more put under pressure it is. And that character that we bring into leadership, into situations, stems from way back. And that's really what we wanted to try and, that for me was one of the reasons that I was really interested in having a look at this particular area.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
I
would
go ahead, please.
I would add to that, Jennifer. I mean, and you know, I think you know from our work that we do a lot of sort of like these retreats in the mountains here in beautiful Switzerland, and I've had the pleasure of working with hundreds of leaders. I mean, maybe thousands of them in the last 15 years of my work at IMD. And the fascinating thing is that when we go through the discussions of what's happening in their life, there's two things that emerge, I mean, very quickly. First of all, is the complexity of their jobs and the fact that they're busier than ever, busier than they have been in previous generations, running from one platform to the other, from one email that is crucial and demanding their attention to a meeting that they participate in. And the time and the juggling, I mean, it's just so very intense. And the higher they go, the more they need to operate based on their default. And their default goes back to sort of like those formative instincts that came from their childhood. And as we go through our reflective walks, as they are pulling away from their business and are able, against the backdrop of the mountains, to actually engage with the deep discussions, they actually talk more about their formative experiences and their childhood, and they go there. I see that Isabella is one of the people participating here. She was a participant on my CLEAR program, where we spent a whole year together. Delighted to see you here, Isabella. And I would say we started the program talking in case studies, I mean, in sort of like business context and all of that. But the deeper we went and the further we went with the program, the more and more people talked about those formative experiences, about what happened in their household, what happened with their parents.
And can you, in reading this book, right, I read it through 3 lenses, one as a professor of leadership, one as a leader myself, and one as a parent. In writing this book, because you as a professor, Shlomo, and you as a coach, Nick, and both of you as advisors to leaders, having written this book and done this research, how has it affected the way you work with leaders that maybe was different than before you wrote this book?
Yeah. Do you want me to do that? I'll go first. So, I mean, yeah. there are certain. So I think I would say there's a couple of things. The first is that one of the things that I definitely pay more attention to now is actually what leaders say or feel about what happens to them when they're put under pressure. So actually, what's the difference between how they are at poise and how they are when they're under pressure? I think that's something I've always looked at a bit, but deliberately I look at it far more now, because that gap between how they are at poise and how they are when everything hits the fan and everything's going wrong and they're not at their best, that gap is where a lot of what is there's a lot of information and data there on actually what's lying underneath all of the poise. The second thing is that there are certain aspects of things that we looked at that I'd always known were important, but I think our research showed were just extra important. I mean, the one that really stands out is self-regulation, right? That if you point to our ability to regulate our emotions, and you can, this is something that you can do too little of, but it's also something you can do too much of, right? And so, and what the ideal amount is varies between people, between situations. There is no one particular ideal, but it does significantly affect us in almost every aspect of how we function as a leader. And the really interesting thing about self-regulation is that although there's a little bit of debate about it, the consensus is that it's probably about 60% genetically inherited. Now, that still leaves 40% that develops and changes as we grow up, but that's an awful lot. And it is, 60% is an awful lot. And so and most of the rest of that 40% is set in place certainly within the first 2 or 3 years. So way before you even enter school, let alone enter a workplace, let alone enter a leadership position, this aspect of yourself, which will affect almost every element of how you function as a leader, is set more or less in stone and is set within us. So that's certainly something that I pay far more attention to now in terms of how does it actually affect people? How is it affecting not just the leader, but also the people around them? Because one of the things that we try and bring out in the book and connects up with our previous book, Leadership OS, is that these aspects of our character, of our personalities, of who we are, they don't just affect us, they affect everyone around us too. If I don't regulate my emotions, if I if I yell, if I'm difficult to read, whichever it is, that affects the people around me just as much as me. And that really is what I think in everything that Shlomo has and I have done, that we've been about, which is the impact that leaders have and the context that they create and the culture that they create. We're just looking at how these things that were set long ago is now feeding into that. But so there are, I look more deliberately at the gap between poise and under pressure, and I look at self-regulation. Those are probably the two key things. Shlomo?
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would underline the fact that when they come with some comments and statements about what the team is doing, what their direct reports are doing, we have a better way to explain that they're part of what is causing that. I mean, that what is happening in your team, what is happening in your immediate environment is actually partially a result of what it is that you bring from those childhood experiences. And there's more terminology and more evidence for that after the research that we've done, to actually ask them or invite them to start reflecting on where their contribution is to whatever is happening on the team's level.
At the risk of going over the wonderful example, which just happened a week or two ago, fresh in memory, a senior, a C-suite, big multinational, comes to me and is complaining that his team is not proactive enough. They don't show enough initiative, right? Never doing. I'm so frustrated with them. Anyway, we dug into it. I'm smiling here. I think the technical term for him is slightly controlling. Control freak might be another way to put it, right? I mean, it's often been the source of his success. He's able to control things, organize things, get things done. He's never short of an opinion. He's very quick to express it. So whenever there's silence in the room, he'll fill it. He's quite directive. He's very opinionated. And you can just see from this that there's probably very little room in his team for them to show initiative and be and be proactive, because he's filled every gap there is before they can even think about it or act, right? Empowerment doesn't even come into it. And we were able to trace this back to him and his father. And the real aha moment for him was when he was talking about how critical his father was, how directive his father was. And we got into that and the impact that had on him, that he always felt he had to try very hard. He always had to be on top of his schoolwork. He always had to be, one step ahead so he didn't get in trouble, so he didn't get criticized. And he was trying his best to prove himself to his father. And then it was really the moment when he was talking about that, and it suddenly clicked that that's exactly how he was being. He was being, as his father had been to him, was how he was being to his team. Except, and that's precisely the sort of thing, as Shlomo said, that we're now, that we try and get into.
Mm-hmm. And as you both said, right, leaders' lives, especially when they're at the top, are becoming more complex, more stressful, etc. When you bring up, like with your example, Nick, you say something like, okay, what was your childhood like? Or tell me about your relationship with your parents. My first question is, how open are leaders to talking about this? And my second question is, with all going on in their lives, how do you frame that focus on their childhood? Why should leaders invest that time in looking at their childhood? How do you justify this? How do you frame it for the leaders that you work with?
I would say the why is why because it matters, and it matters a great deal. And how do we position it? We gradually move into that. I mean, as we do the deep work with leaders. I mean, it doesn't start with that because people still sort of like want to engage in some face saving. I mean, it's sort of like being safe in the environment, and there's a fair amount of posturing that's happening. I mean, in the beginning of a program or an exchange that we go through. But once you establish a trust, I mean, in the classroom or working with a small group as we work with different boards or different teams, then gradually they actually start bringing it up. When we ask about where do you think that originates from, we don't need to ask them about their father or their mother or the relationship after the divorce of their parents. They start bringing it up. I mean, they start like realizing this actually has very deep roots there. And with time and with the methodology that we've developed, I mean, with this, the discussion is becoming much more honest, much more open, and there's a huge amount of disclosure that takes place. Of course, we need to ensure that this is a safe environment, that confidentiality is there. But once we open this, I mean, it's as if the floodgates opened. I mean, they're very interested in going in there because they know that there's a lot that comes from there.
Thank you, Shlomo.
So I often see people in an assessment scenario, 4-hour interview, and certainly after the first hour and a half, it's somewhere I'll go straight. It's, where do you come from? Tell me about your family. Tell me about your parents. I think most leaders like telling that story. How open they are obviously varies a bit, but that's something that we very commonly get into. In terms of why, I'll just reiterate exactly what Shlomo said, is that it will affect you. Your past will affect you, guaranteed 100%. And the only real question for you is to what extent do you want to be aware of that, of how it is affecting you, and to what extent do you want to make sure that you're managing that effect that it has on you?
So when leaders walk into, for example, Shlomo's classroom or Nick into your office, at least my experience is that it's really important for them to feel autonomy, right? And to feel agency in developing themselves as leaders and growing into that potential leader that they want to become. How do you then marry that agency of the people you work with this understanding that somewhere between 40 and 60% of who they are came from things they have no agency over, no control over. And how do you work with that balance in the leaders that you develop?
I think maybe I would just go back to the fact that we're all privileged people, right? Because we're working with very successful people. So I go into every classroom and every intervention that I'm responsible for with a huge amount of respect to the people I work with, because they have been very successful. And our listeners here to this call are people who are operating in very responsible jobs. I mean, they've been successful. As one of my colleagues, our colleagues, John Weeks, I mean, says, there are the kids who waited to eat the marshmallow. I mean, in that marshmallow test. I mean, they were not the ones who were jumping on that. So the agencies there, and the proof of the agencies there in terms of what they've accomplished in life so far to get them to where they are now. But being in this senior kind of like level of operations as senior executives, it's also extremely helpful and useful for them to start reflecting and become more thoughtful about where the agency comes from and to what degree it's limited by some of sort of like the old scripts that they bring from the early childhood, and giving them even more agency to do something about that. So those scripts are not going to go away, but can you develop some other scripts for the areas in which they become a liability? It's part of your success formula. I mean, so like those childhood experiences are part of what contributed to your success, but they also stand in the way and create a difficult situation in some cases. And walking away from these interventions, I feel, and I get evidence from them to the fact that they actually feel that there is even an increased sense of agency. I could actually do something about those moments in which I may have lost it just last week before I had this discussion.
Thank you, Shlomo.
I actually think the two are perfectly compatible in terms of even when we don't have control, we always have a choice. I think we're often met with defensiveness or disbelief, I think, sometimes when we go through the research with leaders in terms of just how much people are affected by this, just how much. But even when these things are deeply set within us, we still have a choice. We still have agency about what we want to do about it. That choice is entirely yours, right? I am hardwired by the time you've reached my crusty old age to be I can go through a dozen emotions in about a millisecond, right? I am very emotionally up and down. And there are good things about that, and there are bad things about it. I can't change that. That's done. It's there, right? And I'm also a pessimist, as Shlomo will say, right? If there's something negative to be seen, I'll find it. I can't change that. But how I let that affect me, how I act on that, that is 100% in my control. And that I can do something about. So I am both destined to feel certain things and react in certain ways, and I have complete autonomy and complete control over how I choose to deal with it.
Thank you, Nick. And I'm going to direct this question at you. And of course, Shlomo, if you would like to chime in or you have thoughts to share, please do that as well. But we joked when we started, Nick, that you've worked with CEOs and you've worked with prisoners, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine you've seen some commonalities in these two populations' childhoods, trauma, violence, etc. Can you think of anything or pinpoint factors that differentiated these two groups in terms of ending up where they ended up, even though maybe they started in similar places?
So, yes, the key thing is even if you the first thing to say is that the vast majority of people, it's not big one-off events. It's not some big trauma. It's the gradual accrual of small experiences, right? So there are cases, and you will certainly find more of them in prison, where abuse, neglect, awful things happen to people. No doubt about it. But for the vast majority of us, it is the accrual of small experiences, right? It's not that one of your parents does one thing that is really awful to you. It's maybe they're not huggers. And maybe that builds up, right? Maybe they're critical because of their desire to try and make you the best that you can be. But maybe that builds up. And it's these smaller things that affect us for the vast majority of us, rather than big one-off events. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that without doubt, and the research kind of is fairly clear on and kind of drawing this out, that the biggest influence here is whether there is anything in your life that will cushion, mitigate the impact of whatever negative's happening. So is there one person? Is there one relationship? Is there something positive there, right? So one of your parents may be horrible, but maybe one of them isn't, right? Maybe you've got friends outside that are really important to you. But it is often the, whether there is something supportive there to mitigate, lessen the impact of whatever it is that is happening to you that is negative or is difficult for you. And that's the key thing that kind of the research will point to. And it is really important that we have something like that in our lives.
Thank you, Nick. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Shlomo?
No, I think, I mean, this is a very good summary of that. I mean, it's not the big T of trauma, it's the little T's, I mean, that many times get accumulated, and those just vary in magnitude and size, I mean, between these different populations. The majority of the people we're dealing with, it's the small T's, but it's mainly how they remember those T's, I mean, and what they make of them. So it's not so much like what objectively may have happened. We don't have a way to measure that. It's what my perception of what has happened, what it is that I carried with me.
I think that's a very good point to remember as well, right? It's your interpretation of these events that happened in childhood, not the objective event itself. I mean, you two came into this book already experts in the space. And as you said, Nick, you read over 1,200 articles to prepare for this book. What in your research surprised you the most?
Do you want to go first, or shall I?
I think you mentioned already, I mean, for me, at least that part was like, it's the genetics part. I mean, so like that there's strong evidence that 60% of this is genetics. I mean, that was sort of like an overwhelming number. I mean, so like we knew that there's a lot that is determined. I mean, early on, I at least was kind of like flabbergasted to see that it's around 60% that is. But Nick, maybe go in and chime in, please.
No, so actually I would just, at the risk of just reiterating what you've said rather than saying something different, I would agree. It is, I mean, I was joking, I was overruled by just about everyone. I had a far less polite title for the book, which was more or less aligned with, well, you know, you're stuffed then. Which, because there was a point when we were going through all of this research, and it was like, wow, okay. It's amazing how that any of us can do anything, you know, anything about anything, right? This is all set in us. You just are the way you are. Get used to it. But there is, I think that was also a turning point for us when we reached that kind of level of kind of almost being so surprised about it, we were almost laughing about it. It was just, this is incredible. Was actually then, okay, but what can you do about it? because both of us are in the change business, right? We've both worked with trying to change people, trying to change cultures, trying to change situations. That's what we're all about. And so it was, okay, so what can we do? And that then led us down into something far more practical and actually finding some hope. And this book, as with all of our books, has a large element of how-to to it. So it's actually, here's practically what you can do.
Yeah, and that was one thing I really liked about the book, right? You had incredible research evidence to back up the statements that you make, but you also have worksheets and activities that people can do to help them think about their childhood influences and then what they do with it going forward. It's actually that your response, Nick, was a nice segue into maybe the final question I have before we turn it over to the audience question. So as I said earlier, I read the book through 3 lenses, one as a leadership professor, one as a leader myself, and then one as a parent of 2 children. And you know, your stuff could have been one topic title for the book, but I have to say I read the book thinking, oh dear, what am I doing now to screw up my kids so that they're not going to be able to lead at their full potential 30 years from now? And what are, for those people in the audience that maybe share those 2 roles or these 2 lenses that I looked at the book through, which is leader and parent, what are the 1 or 2 things you would recommend to those in the audience who are parents to think about when they're raising children so that they can help raise these children to be healthy leaders rather than children that need to rewrite that code?
So that's actually fascinating, Jennifer, that you bring this up, because this was not like what I expected to happen. And it's actually happened in every class, in every session that we delivered this, that people that we expected would start dealing with their leadership issues immediately switched to thinking about their children back at home and whether they screwed them up or not, and what could they do, or that it's too late, I mean, and they have messed it up already or whatever. So I was surprised by that. I mean, but it repeatedly has been the theme, I mean, in our sessions. And I would say, first of all, I encourage them to think about what Winnicott, I mean, so like the very like known psychologist said about being a good enough parent. I mean, the first thing that you want to think about is whether or not you've been a good enough parent. And when I think about my children, I mean, so like who are grown up now, operating in the world on their own, I ask myself sometimes, have I been a good enough parent? So I'm not asking myself if I was the perfect parent or the most incredible role model, but was I a good enough parent? And I call myself, I hope I'm not kidding myself by saying, yes, I think I was a good enough parent. They're decent adults, I mean, operating in the world with their challenges from what they brought from the household and how we are as a family, but they're operating in a very more than reasonable way in the world. The other thing is that I discovered that some of those people who are asking me these questions are interested in making sure that their kids have what it takes in order to be the next CEO or sort of like the leaders that they're envisioning them to be. And my first advice to them is to let go of whatever picture you have of the future of your children, because life happens to us when we're very busy planning, and certainly when we're very busy planning for our children, and then their life opens up. I mean, they go their merry way and they find their path. So one of the best things that you could do for your child is to just, I wouldn't say lower your expectations, but just like not come with your expectations. Make sure that you construct them with time based on what their hopes and their dreams are. And then from there, I would go to say, be there for them. I mean, so like be attentive to what they're experiencing, because one of the things that we see when we're looking at levels of anxiety, when we're looking at levels of self-confidence, is that a lot of that comes with the approach that they've experienced in their early years, whether the parent was controlling or allowing autonomy, whether they expressed affection and so like were trying to give that love in different ways to them to make sure that they're a secure base for them in their life or not. So if you could do that, that would be the best gift that you could give them.
Thank you, Shlomo.
Nick,
Sorry,
you're smiling.
Shaking my head because as Shlomo was starting, as much as I'm a fan of Winnicott, I thought there is a basic display of personality differences, right? Shlomo's optimism and positivity versus, okay, something else now.
Go ahead, please.
So
Contradict me.
So to reiterate what Shlomo said, will we screw up our children? I mean, that isn't even a question, right? I mean, it's just not even a question. Yes, of course you will. But also Shlomo is right. It's about being good enough rather than being perfect, right? There are three things I think that I would do now if I was starting again. The first one I think I always knew, but pay particular attention to affection, right? Really, you have one job, which is not just to keep your child alive, okay? But once you've got past that, to ensure your child feels loved. And actually, it's not always as easy as it sounds, that, when you're busy and you're running between things, and maybe you've been brought up in a family where a handshake was as good as a hug, right? Or you just didn't express emotion. But so it's not always easy, but that is a core absolute thing. And there's no replacement for it, no getting around it. Your child has to feel it, no matter what. The second thing is to help your child understand what they are feeling and what you are expressing. If you can encourage your child, if you can support your child to understand emotions, so talk about emotions. I'm feeling this because, what are you feeling? So what you're just, it seems to me that you're feeling this. Is that right? And is that because of this or because of that? But actually talk about emotions. And I think most of us and most families probably don't do that enough. But if you can help your child understand emotions, all the evidence shows that it will help them regulate their emotions better. That doesn't mean keep it in, but actually make sure that they're deliberate in how they're managing. And the final thing is to think very carefully about the scripts, the ways in which the routines you use for dealing with tension and conflict when it happens in the house. And in particular, between you and your partner. So between you and your child, but also between you and your partner. Because we like to think that's slightly separate. But actually, there's a lot of evidence out there that how you and your partner deal with disagreement and tension and conflict, how you argue, right, can have a significant impact on your children. It's an important part of the context within which your children grow up. And even though it doesn't involve your child, hopefully most of the time, that is a really, really important part of the context that you're providing for them.
If I may add one more
Yes,
thing
please.
from the research there that we highlight in the book, is that when you look at parenting, too controlling a parenting style and too permissive a parenting style actually gets people in trouble. So there was sort of like a notion, I mean, certainly after World War II, I mean, when sort of like the old way of parenting was criticized so greatly as one of the reasons for what has happened in the world, I mean, in the big wars, that we need to be more permissive to children and so like give them what they want and just let them loose. What we're finding in the research is that that's also not very helpful. So if there is a magic formula, and I'm sure there isn't one, it's really to give some clear boundaries, but within them to allow for a fair amount of autonomy. So not to be too permissive, not too controlling, but somewhere in the middle.
And as you said, Shlomo, like when I read it, a lot of things were saying not too much this, but not too little this. And so it's like this Goldilocks formula. And I'm thinking, what does Goldilocks look like, right? What is that right amount? Because and maybe that's a great segue into the first question from the audience, because I think that is, you talked about generations. This is also cultural. We have different culture. All of us as leaders have different cultural backgrounds, and what is permissive in one culture is very much not permissive in another, right? So Sigrid asks, what about cultural experiences in the very early years? Where does culture come into this?
So I think this is one of those things where there is more differences. There are bigger differences within groups than there are between groups. So are there cultural differences between cultures? Absolutely, completely, definitely, yes. But I think what the determining factor is how do you as a child feel about your parents' behavior and the context that you're growing up and what you're experiencing. And that's all about how you tend to compare yourselves to, well, how you feel about it and what's actually happening, but also how you compare yourself to what's around you, to what's immediately around you. So there are very definitely cross-cultural differences, but there are far less differences than we thought there would be when it comes to certain childhood experiences and their outcomes and their effects on us. So, I mean, for example, I just use the example of parents arguing, right? If your parents argue a lot and they don't really come to any a constructive conclusion in their arguments, they don't resolve them constructively, it doesn't really matter where in the world you are. It doesn't really matter which culture you belong to, right? If you get bullied at school, I don't think it really matters, right? If you feel that your parents, that one of your parents, if one of your parents doesn't love you, however you judge that, and how you judge that might be different between cultures. But again, it doesn't really matter. So we actually found less cross-cultural differences here, even though they do exist in terms of what the norms are. They were less relevant in terms of the impact on us.
And that's a very good point, Nick. And it goes back to what you said earlier around the perception of it, right? So maybe my grandmother had a different expectation for the affection she expected from her parents than I would have, but it's how that expectation is perceived by the individual that really matters, right?
Yeah, and it kind of actually connects up in a way with our previous book. In our previous book, we said, look, what's more important, and actually, whether you are a motivational leader or a caring leader is kind of irrelevant. What matters is whether your people feel motivated and whether they feel cared for. Well, in the same way, it doesn't really matter what we as parents intend in a way, and I don't want to say it doesn't matter what we do, of course we do, but what's more important is what does the child feel? How does the child experience it?
Thank you. Bogdan asks, why always fathers? What about mamas, babysitters, siblings, or other kids?
Okay. Do you mind if I take this one, Shlomo? Because
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Fine. So there's a couple of things to say here. It's not always fathers, and in fact, the vast majority of the research is on mothers. And if you check when you actually read the book, there's an awful lot in there about mothers. There are a couple of things to say though, and yes, friends are really important, but there is less research done on them. And by the time we start meeting friends, our parents have already had an impact on us. And that's why it's often parents are the most critical, because they're the ones who are and it might be grandparents if we're growing up with grandparents, but it's the parental figures around us that we're growing up with. And which is more important often depends upon the particular family unit that you're in. If you've got one parent who's always traveling away on work, they may be less influential on you. It's very much depends upon the situation. But the vast majority of research is done on mothers. There is increasing research being done on fathers and some more research being done on kids. But in general, the research is really all about mothers. One other thing to say, in the book, we have used examples, and we've tended to use examples of men. And the reason that we did that is because a lot of the examples that we're talking about are when things go wrong. And so we didn't want to just describe it in terms of women. but the reality is that it's not just fathers at all. Sorry, and anything you'd add, Shlomo?
No, I think the family is the first enterprise that we are in. I mean, and so like the dinner discussions are really the first board meetings and the first team meetings that we have. And because all of this is determined in the early years, while we have research that shows about relationship with teachers and relationship with the peer group, I mean, and the friends and bullying that happens in the school, the majority of what we focused on is actually the earlier years. I mean, and that's where the mother and the father, or the absence of one of them, is so critical. And if in some families where it's a broader set of people, so it could be grandparents, or it could be an aunt or an uncle that are playing a role, and then it's that constellation. But it is quite a small and limited group of people that have a huge impact on the formulation of those early scripts.
Thank you. We received one question in the question and answer section specifically, and this person said, I can connect to what I'm hearing and recognize it on some of my actions, but considering Nick mentioned 60% of self-regulation is predetermined from an early age, how do people raised in violent environments become leaders or manage stress and conflictual situations?
Okay. That really depends. So one of the things that we draw out in the book is we draw upon Karen Horney's kind of idea of moving towards, moving away, and moving against, as in terms of three basic reactions we can have to tension, conflict, violence. There are none of those which are always the best, right? So it's not that there is an ideal way of doing it. They've all got strengths, they've all got weaknesses. And so whatever script it is that we've left childhood with, whatever tendency it is in terms of what happens to us and how we respond, the issue then becomes there are none of those that are guaranteed pathway to success. There are none of them which are, well, there are some which are guaranteed pathway to failure, but there's none which is a guaranteed pathway to success, and you can do something about it. And in fact, managing conflict is one of the areas where I think we've focused quite a lot on in terms of how you deal with it, because I think it's very common for, this is something we all deal with at work, right? And they're often key pivotal moments, how we deal with tension, how we deal with conflict. In terms of specifically about violent households, what you tend to find is not that people who've grown up in a particularly violent household are more inclined towards any one of those three patterns of responding. It is about the extremity to which they are. So if they move towards, they will move towards with great intensity, and they will try and smooth things over and create harmony. If they move away, then they move away, right? And they try and avoid it, and they try and duck away from the conflict or tension. And if they move against it, oh boy, right? They, as my grandmother would say, they can pick a fight in a nunnery. They react strongly to it as a defense mechanism. So it's more about the extremity of the reaction. So it can be harder for people who've grown up in that extreme environment to learn how to deal with it, but they can. And if they've become leaders, and they've obviously done something right to deal with it, right? Whether they can do more is another matter, but they've obviously found some way of dealing with it.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and I really like this one because so much of what we talked about is leader downward. So how is the leader affecting the environment? This question goes the opposite direction. So how subordinates who suffer from the same issues affect leaders? And what do you suggest for that dynamic? If you see a subordinate who has these yes, markers or characteristics. You read the book, right? You see these in your subordinate. What do you do, or how do you address this issue? And this person also asks, what external factors matter as well in this dynamic?
So this is beautiful, right? Because it talks about the interplay in the systemic kind of a way. I mean, and we are looking at sort of like teams and organizations as systems. And obviously, so like the script that I bring as a leader is being interfaced with the scripts that all of my direct reports are bringing in. I mean, it's sort of like they push the trigger buttons in me, and then I start reacting in a way that comes from my own childhood, which sort of like falls into their tendencies and what they bring from home. And that interplay, that tango in which we might be stepping on each other's feet, is preventing us from dancing in the right way and delivering the performance, which is ultimately what we are focusing on, right? Because we're working with people with or in organizations that are supposed to drive performance in the best way and to create organizational cultures that are driving high performance. So one of the things that we try to do when we work with teams is to actually create more of a safe environment to start talking about those triggers, to talk about the sensitivities, to update people's narratives about themselves and to share them with one another in order to be able to identify that. And one of the things that I've done recently with the board of a big organization, $9 billion organization, is that I had them go through this process individually and then do speed dating. I mean, in the workshop, talking about like, here are my buttons and here's how you push my buttons. And then the other side talking about that. And it's incredible. So like after just like an hour and a half of speed dating that we did just within a team of 6 people, there was this sigh of relief that all of the undiscussables were actually put on the table. We recognize we all carry that, we all do it, and we could actually support each other with sort of like addressing some of these issues.
So everything he said, plus I would add that if you're just doing this with a team member and you want to do something about it, right, and you suspect there's something going on, I wouldn't get into a conversation about their childhood. I wouldn't get into a conversation about any of that stuff. What I would do is get very practical and focus on, and not even about how they're behaving. I think what I would begin with is what is their impact and what are they triggering in others. I've noticed that that people often respond to you by doing X and Y. Is that the way that you want them to respond? Is that useful? And then you work backward from that. Okay, well, I wonder what you can do about that. Because I think by focusing on impact and what it is that people are triggering in others, you're far less likely to evoke defensiveness in them. And if this is something which has a childhood cause, then it probably is something that could trigger defensiveness. So I think begin with impact, begin by focusing on what they're triggering with others, and then say, well, is that useful? Is it not useful? Is it what you want? Is it not what you want? Right? And if not, okay, what can we do about it? Right?
Thank you.
And maybe you could try this. I think it's an easier way, less defensive way of getting into it. Sorry.
Thank you, Nick and Shlomo. I can say it's been such a privilege to have this time and interview you and ask you these additional questions about the book. And I would say it was a privilege to read this book. I could count on one hand the number of books I would say that have really impacted my life, and I would actually add this to that list. So I can highly recommend the book and encourage those in the webinar to listen as well. Thank you so much again, Shlomo and Nick, for this time and this generosity of your thoughts. And congratulations again on writing such a beautiful piece.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.